Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm Nathan Rittenhouse, and today Cameron is out and about, and so I'm sitting down with Grandpa Rittenhouse to ask him a couple questions about the search for identity in the 1960s and if there are parallels to our time. Lots of you will know him I quote him from time to time in life, and lots of people call him Grandpa Rittenhouse, but it turns out he actually is my grandpa. So, Grandpa, thanks for the time this morning. Grandma's resting on the couch, and I hear your rooster crowing out there. And I was thinking, this is July 2nd or 3rd? Second. It's July 2nd, and most of the United States is sweltering hot. What was the temperature here this morning?
It was low 50s.
Okay, I saw 47 when I got up early, so pretty good spot to be in a hot part of the year. But part of the reason I want to talk to you is I'm 37, and when you were 37, it was 1968. And we're living in a time in which I've heard a lot of people make parallels between some of the movements in the youth, political, international things that are happening that have some semblance to the 60s. So what do we have? We have John F. Kennedy. We have the Vietnam War, Nixon, the Cultural Revolution in China, all the civil rights movements, the assassination of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Can you, Junior, kind of give us, from somebody who was in your 30s and the 60s, what are some of the big political and cultural moves? And then we'll get into the spiritual and the identity stuff a little later. But just as you reflect on that decade, what were people excited about? What were people worried about? What was the general feel?
I don't know really where to start on this, but I think that one of the big things is they were starting to question maybe this is not what you want to get into yet, but they're starting to question the whole idea of what we're being taught, that if you go to school and get a good education, make money, you'll be happy, And young people were starting to question that.
Now, so can you back up and say, why do you think that was? What was going on because that would be a parallel to our time too, where you have a lot of people saying, hey, a college degree isn't all that it's cracked up to be, and making money isn't the meaning of life. What was behind that in the 60s?
I know they maybe have a relation to and this maybe is going around the question, but the other question was with the church. Church attendance was dropping, and it was losing some of its importance, and we can get into that maybe later about the response of the church to what was happening. But you didn't want to go there.
Well, but that's another tally mark in the things that would be similar to this time. It's easy to find a newspaper that says this denomination is losing, or institutional religion is collapsing. But let me maybe ask it to you this way: were the 1960s actually unique, or when you look back across, you have the advantage of being able to remember? You're 92, so you can remember a good bit of what the rest of us learned as history. Were the 60s unique in that, or were there always those ebbs and flows?
Yeah, it's hard for me. I was thinking mostly in terms of the church and things that were happening. I hadn't really given a lot of thought to what was going on in society, other than, like you say, the war, and the beginning of protests was something new, I think, about Vietnam. And that was a real thing. I buried, say, 6 boys from Pocahontas County who were killed in Vietnam. So that was that kind of thought.
So the death toll was felt here, even in this house, yeah.
And I think proportionally, more people from the mountains died because they knew how to use guns.
Yeah, they were,
and were put in there.
Yeah. So let's back up this way, and let's go in the direction of the kind of that spiritual longing. And so here you were in your mid 30s, farming to live, pastoring a couple churches, married with 4 kids, and the world kind of seemed crazy. But you had a unique experience in the 50s. So you had finished college. You had done rebuilding work in Germany and refugee resettlement in Turkey and Bulgaria, and you had kind of that post-war European Christian disaster response and refugee reconciliation resettlement. You did all of that, came back from that, finished college, finished seminary, then went to the jungle of Ecuador for a couple years. I guess Dad was born down there. He always jokingly said he was born on a banana leaf, but that isn't true. In 1961. And so then by what year did you come back to the United States?
54.
64.
54. Yeah.
So you came back in 54, but then when you went to Ecuador and came back,
it was 64.
That was 64. 10 years later. So in 1964, you show up in the mountains of West Virginia because you saw a spiritual hunger and a need here. And it wasn't a supported or a funded mission from anybody. So I think your line was, if we got a big garden and a little milk cow, it'll be hard to starve us out. And started working here, planting and encouraging churches. But then one of the interesting things that gets associated with the 60s is the hippie movement. And I think I saw in a publication one where a reporter had come and spent time here and looked at your guest book, and there were like 700 people that had come and visited you at one of those years. And I remember my dad saying that as a little boy, he remembered going to bed in his upstairs bedroom listening through the register. He said, with you arguing about spirituality with all the hippies coming through. But tell us a little bit about the hippie movement then that happened in the 60s and how that intersected the work you were doing.
Okay. My upbringing, of course, with the Church of the Brethren was always kind of counterculture.
Uh-huh.
And we had that in our DNA, you might say.
Yeah.
And so the hippies were attracted to us because we were living a kind of a self-sufficient life. Not to get too complicated in the story, but the church, and I want to come back to this again, the church was losing membership. And the response overall among the denominations to that was towards church union. And there were big discussions on the consultation on church union, which was called Cuckoo, about the possibilities of all the churches coming together.
Merging.
And we were involved in that. And then also, we were pressured to lose some of our uniqueness to be more attractive.
So more seeker friendly, yeah.
Yeah. And those things were going on. And so the idea was to also have an educated ministry for everybody and consolidate the little churches so that you could afford to pay a preacher.
Uh-huh.
And so we were kind of a reaction to that. And they didn't think it was worthwhile for us to come here with these 7 little meeting places. So they, one man said it was dumping money down a rat hole.
Right.
And so the answer to them for me was coming from the mission field and coming from college and seminary was these people aren't worth messing with.
Right.
And so I said, well, this is where I thought that God was calling me. And so there's when I said, if I have a farm and a big garden and a milk cow, I can stay here.
Yeah.
And so that we were here with our family, growing a big garden and our milk cow and living a life that was attractive to the kids who were disillusioned. For instance, among the hippies, they weren't just lost kids in a sense that they didn't know who they were. But say one was the daughter of a professor at the university, and another is a daughter or a son of a doctor in New England. You know, that's the caliber of young people that were coming in.
It was a well-educated, upper-class kind of disillusionment that.
Yeah.
Now, what made them think though, like, hey, I'm just going to go walk off into the mountains in West Virginia?
Yeah.
Where did that?
Here's an example. There was one girl whose family had been Jewish and rich people.
Mm-hmm.
And she moved in with 5 fellas. They were going to start a new kind of family and have one mother and 5 daddies. And they went out into the mountain, on the side of the mountain, and built a house by hand. and it was really amazing. The water was in the spring. The water was running through one side of the house and out the floor of the other, and these teenage kids try to be self-sufficient and didn't know beans about anything.
So, and you go up and visit them?
Of course, yes. And like I say, they were really searching. And one man he said that that brethren preacher down there is bringing them in.
They thought you were the.
They always wanted to come and talk here.
So there was a little bit of a funny thing going on there where you were kind of ideally positioned. I mean, you probably couldn't have made it up, but in hindsight, it worked out. So you have, growing up on a farm in Maryland, then all of your Europe post-war experience, all of your educational experience, but then coming right out of the jungle in a deeply spiritually animistic, all that spiritual. I mean, you lived and breathed among the idea of just the raw animism and spirituality of the jungle for a couple years. So you've got that spiritual background and ability to engage. And then there's a sense in which you kind of were out hippieing the hippies here. Here you are living, grandma making bread, milking cows, growing beans, raising a family.
Their own flour and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. But you weren't doing it for the point of survival. It was to kind of fund your mission to be able to preach here in the mountains. And so it seemed to me that you were doing what they wanted to do, but they were seeking to do that as the goal, and you were doing it as a means to something else.
That's right.
And that could have probably been an interesting.
Well, it answered a lot of questions. I think that for them, and there was a kind of a natural attraction there because we were doing something that was different. Mm-hmm. And like I say, a kind of a counterculture. They knew that I had gone in alternative service instead of going to Korea, and was involved in resettling refugees and that kind of thing in Europe.
Yeah. Now, you talked about the new kind of family that was being formed. Was that the one that girl's parents wrote you a letter years later, or is that a different person?
I did. I got a letter from a doctor in New England thanking me for. I married several of the couples, convinced them that they should be married.
There was another story. Maybe this will get off into the weeds that. Because this ties into where I want to go here. You were telling a story about a young boy with long hair and the farmer. Yeah. Can you tell that story? That was always kind of a humorous one.
He said that when he grew long hair, and he said, I started wondering about him. Then I started thinking, well, he was pretty good looking, so I started worrying about myself.
And everybody always kind of laughs.
This is a parallel that you're kind of looking for. But the confusion of sexes. Where men were wearing long hair and looking feminine, and I picked the boy up to take him where he was going, about 7 miles out of the way, and actually he had beautiful red hair, but I did not know for the first 15 minutes whether he was a boy or a girl.
So that's really helpful, and the reason that I want to come back, just hone in on this for a second, is that I think, particularly if you're listening to this and you're involved in church leadership or you're curious about culture or where things are going, that we're talking about 60 years ago here. Yeah. And so I think, when a lot of the thing about the asexual, transgender, polyamorous, I hear people telling stories about all of this, and I think, well, I remember Grandpa talking about all of this from the 60s. And then, so here we are 60 years later, and the church that you're involved in went from 15 people to 170, 180, now. And so really that was a time of great chaos, but the church that I'm a part of and grew up in grew out of that confusion, primarily just by what were you preaching and teaching at that time? And it probably, maybe the answer is it wasn't anything special or anything different, but when you look at the political, the social, the people who are afraid of the Cubans and the Russians and the Chinese and the spiritual collapse of the institutional church, and you got a bunch of hippies running around and young people who are disillusioned. What were you preaching and teaching at that time?
I think I went to, I was, to be honest, I say kind of a liberal seminary where we had criticism of the scriptures, evaluating what was right and what was wrong, what was myth and what wasn't, and that kind of thing.
Somebody said you went to seminary, but it didn't take.
But I think where we came out was that I had to give my life for something. And actually, I enjoyed, one of my favorite things in college was, I didn't major in it, but was philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoyed that. But I came to the place and watching what a lot of philosophers had thought, and then in the end of their lives, they came to latch on to something that didn't make near as much sense as a lot of things they rejected.
Mm-hmm.
But I decided, well, I needed to pick something. And so I decided that I would quit judging the Bible and let it judge me, and preach its truth and take it as the Word of God. And so I think that was a basic assumption, while the general church and the mood of a lot of the regular denominations at that time was moving away from that.
And let's just remember, this is coming off the 1950s and German higher criticism. And
Yes.
those of you who've been to seminary, you'll remember all your text critical stuff from that movement and phase.
And so just rather simple, that the Bible was to be believed and be taught, and that if we followed it, this was the most meaningful life. And so we chose a few simple things. I mean, I don't know if this is of interest to you or not, but being brethren, while the general church was giving up its uniqueness, we chose to stay with our communion where we wash feet, because the Bible said to wash feet.
Yeah.
And we encourage women to cover their heads in worship because of 1 Corinthians 11, and that kind of thing. And then we stuck with a believer's baptism.
Yeah.
And so the churches here, when I first came, were not uniquely brethren. We picked out some of those things to kind of identify who we were. But the basic idea was that the Bible was to be believed and to put into practice.
Yeah. There's an interesting, I was part of a church in Boston that had kind of a strong Anabaptist background and flavor to it. And they had said that the future of the Anabaptist churches will come out of the inner city hipsters and the people who are looking for a church that is intentional in the relationships. And so we talk about love feast, that, but also distinctive in dress in a way that there is a little more like being part of a gang maybe than being part of the broader American culture. And so I see some of those parallels happening today of people looking for a faith that gives meaning to all components of their lives, not just kind of a Sunday morning expression.
And then we were a little different here because the focus, which I could say a Baptist evangelical type of focus on personal salvation, which we agreed with, but more than that, we also stressed Jesus as Lord. And then we also, the West Virginians are pretty individualistic. And one of the things we offered was that faith was to be lived out in community.
Mm-hmm.
And so our love feast, where we gathered around the table and washed each other's feet, was different than just going to the altar. So we had something of community in there that the other churches were more individualistic and salvation.
You are really pushing, and have all your life, really encourage people to think about how the other people are part of what it means for them to be saved, and the community, the responsibility that we have to other people as a byproduct of our relationship with God.
So that was part of what we were preaching. And actually the church was not really known. Most of the people wouldn't know that there was a church of the Brethren in Pocahontas County.
Sure, yeah. But you didn't come for that, so that's. But there's so many funny stories of. Well, tell some of these. The guy who wanted to be your holy man. Tell that story.
Well, this is when the hippies were coming in, and some of them had some really, they would say, far out concepts of religion. But this man came up, and he came in and said he offered to be my holy man. And he said, I won't eat much, just a little bit of rice, and I'll be your holy man. You could be initiated into me. And I said, well, there's a problem. I'm initiated into Jesus. And he said, oh, you don't understand what I mean. He said, and he started to do a little demonstration to go in a little trance about how spiritual he was. And I said, I think I do understand. But he wanted to live here and be my holy man.
What was the one where the state police called about Jesus was in his car?
That was another one. And some pretty strange ideas. There was a fella parked in a car, spent the night in the car, and policeman stopped, and I believe he thought he was Jesus.
But didn't the sheriff call and say, hey, Jesus is parked in his car up here, you might want to come meet him? So that gives some flavor for the time. But talk to me then about how you went from, so people were coming, they were interested, and a lot of people just passing through needed a place to stay maybe and something to eat, or have questions answered. But then there are people who are here now who were on that journey of, who are still here, who did become believers and joined the church. And can you say something, because I think this would be an encouraging message to a lot of people who are listening that maybe have friends or family or maybe nieces, nephews, adult children, whatever, who kind of feel like they're a little confused in life in a lot of these categories, physically, spiritually, meaning in life. What did that transition look like for people who really then ended up joining the church? It seems like there was a spiritual openness, but then once you kind of bored down into some specifics, what was that trajectory like for a lot of people? Or maybe you can't say this is the way that it always turned out, but I'm sure it was a slow process and a slow change in people's lives. Or were there people who seemingly quickly got it and converted and joined the church? How did that?
There's two kind of systems that some people believe that you have 20 things you have to believe to be a member. And we went the other way, where we accepted people, and when they confessed Christ, we baptized them and prayed for them to receive the Spirit, but then let God work on them.
Yeah.
And so following Christ, salvation is a gift, but learning to be a Christian and become Christ-like is a lifelong journey. And so, say, to give an example, we wouldn't say that a nonviolent position, and I hate to say political pacifism because that's something else, but you
wouldn't make your convictions a prerequisite for somebody else to join and be part of the fellowship.
We would say, we introduce you to Christ, and then we share where we are, but we let God work on the people. Mm-hmm. And so we have what I told one fellow, we have a glorious mess, because we have people believing many different things, but we accept them and then let God work on them. And so, for example, where I referred to a while ago, where I did alternative service at the draft, we had one fellow who was a member of our church for 8 years, and when the Iran hostages were in, that he decided as a Christian that he didn't believe that military force was going to answer that question,
Yeah.
So it took him 8 years to come to that conclusion, but he was a member and active.
And then we've had many members who were part of the active military.
And then we have, I go to speak at the Memorial Day service, and we pray for the men and women who are in service and that kind of thing. So, so
we probably, it sounds funny to say, but that idea that you got started in there, here we are 60 years later, that I live in that, of really, if you look at a socioeconomic, political diversity, our church is phenomenal in that category. If you look across the spectrum of who believes what, but still prays together and washes each other's feet, it's pretty phenomenal. But I think, the danger in all of that is that it sounds like a free for all, and then it just turns into a big pile of globbly gook theologically. But in order to do that, you really have to have a very strong, clear statement and conviction about what the scriptures are and what's right and wrong.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the thing that's been interesting for me to watch in your ministry, and then many of the others that you've trained, is this ability to have a very clear line in the sand of what's right and wrong, and a very open arm embrace and care for and pastoral ministry to people who aren't at that same place. So we don't have good. We like things that are cut and dry and very clear cut, but we don't have a lot of good examples of that anywhere.
We do have a commitment that the Bible is the Word of God, and we will study it, and we will try our best to follow it. So that's a commitment. Where I am on that journey isn't as important as the direction I'm going. So I'm open to be taught, and I'm searching to know God's will.
Give your illustration of the little tree in the forest as kind of a picture of spiritual growth.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what you're saying.
You're talking about that it's growing toward the sun, but it never gets there. Tell that idea, the idea that a little sapling is growing toward the sun and it never gets there. But
I was thinking about two different things, but that is true. A little tree grows straight and tall because it's reaching for the sun. But it never gets there, but it makes it grow straight and tall. But what I was also thinking about is I came here and bought a farm that had been pulped.
Yeah, so all the trees have been cut off.
And I know what mature timber looks like. And but I was in a brush patch. And so instead of grieving over the fact that I didn't have tall timber, mature timber, I went rabbit hunting and picked blackberries. And that's the way of the church. Over the last 60 years, I think we're coming from a blackberry patch to seeing some mature timber, which you're a part of.
Yeah, but the important thing here for those who are listening in on this is that I think there are a lot of people who are part of churches who feel like their mature timber is being wiped out right now, and the land's going to be left with brambles. And so the encouragement that I want people listening to this to take from it is, if we use the metaphor of, here's somebody who bought a farm that was clear cut and full of rabbits and briar patches. What?
So I planted trees,
you planted trees and cleared the brush and grew maybe last year, Madeline and I were deer hunting, and I was looking at that little section of forest, and we had a neat experience in there. But when I came back down to the house, I asked you, I said, the trees in there aren't really that, they're 40 years old, but there aren't any. And you said, well, all that was a briar patch. Yeah. And so you've gotten the experience of watching your great-grandchildren hunt in trees that you planted, which I think is a good picture for the future of the people who are in church leadership right now, are kind of curious about the future of the churches that they're part of, is they might be listening to this feeling like they're in the briar patch, but your existence and the existence of a healthy church on the other side of that is really a great testimony to what God can do with a briar patch.
Yeah, and I think it goes to that we have to live. It's not just this is a briar patch and that's where I have to pick berries and rabbit hunt, but that's true if we're living in a time of freedom, and the church has had a lot of influence on the government, and it's considered a good thing to become a Christian. But then there's some times when you're persecuted for being a Christian and you're not in charge. And so there are different, culturally, there are different stages of what it means to be a Christian. Say like some areas now, say in India or Africa, it's kind of hard to be a Christian.
Yeah. And
in America, it has been considered, in the past, it's been considered a socially acceptable thing to become a Christian, And so it's maybe an advantage socially and financially in every way to be a Christian. And so there are stages in the growth and development of the church, just like there are. And maybe we're passing from one time into another,
Well, and I was thinking, I forget what year it was. There was sometime in the 1960s where Time magazine had a famous cover that said "God is dead." But I don't know if you would have seen it at that time.
I did. But,
okay.
and then
but you,
another
but,
one came out, Nietzsche, it said, God says Nietzsche's dead.
God says Nietzsche's dead. But the reason I point that out is it's kind of funny. So here you have maybe Time Magazine is more of a cultural institution at that time, where out of the academy and the political movement, there's the death of God. But everybody kind of forgot to tell you and Grandma, you were just out here planting trees and baptizing people. And so I think that's a good thing for the church to remember also, is that you can look at what's going on in the culture, but really that's not where we get our directives as a church from. So we'd be aware of these shifts and phases, but
well, when we were just, our denomination was recommending that we close these churches down, they weren't really sustainable. And the district executive would say to me, you're trying to keep alive a church that's been dead for 10 years. That's past. And I said, well, only down in your heart, you're not sure. Maybe we're 20 years ahead of time and not 10 years behind, of having a self-supporting ministry because these little churches couldn't afford to pay $60,000 to get a minister, So that's where the church was being outpriced and couldn't find ministers, know. And I think that's relevant again to what was happening back then.
Yeah, so it's I do see a lot of parallels, and I see what people thought was a disaster at the time. But what's required in that is those really were big, tumultuous times culturally, and we're living in those again. But what's needed, because God hasn't changed in this, what's needed is probably, what do you think? Young men and women willing to go give it a try and put down roots and say, I'm going to commit to trying this out for 50 years and see what happens. That's a big ask, but if you had to change anything looking back, what can you say, what you learned about God and yourself in that process?
Well, for me personally, when I first came out, I tried to do everything. I was traveling 40,000 miles a year, running circles, trying to visit everybody and preach. I was preaching 4 times a Sunday and having 3 prayer meetings a week,
Yeah.
And I got hot in the head and tight in the chest and was ready to quit.
Mm-hmm.
And then I woke up and realized I was cheating the people. And so I preached for 10 years and nobody ever talked about giving me a raise. And so then I decided, well, I was going to give them 5 years notice. And if they could find somebody dumb enough to replace me and try to preach in 7 churches, or...
Well, hang on, we got to add what were you getting paid a week?
Well, the 7 churches, 6 of them were giving me $15 a month. And the one church was giving me $50.
Yeah, so you were preaching in 7 churches for $140 a month. So then, when we talk about being paid, let's just keep that in perspective.
The district was giving me some support, and the brother was giving me some support, and then they decided that it wasn't worth it, and so that's when I bought the farm and
anyway,
deeper.
So when you're talking about getting a raise, we're not talking about huge sums here. But anyway,
the idea here, the thing was, in Ephesians it says the leaders are to equip the saints for ministry, and all at once it struck me that I was like a coach telling the team to sit on the bench, and I was to go out there to do it. And they were watching me perform. And so the way it really is, the minister is not an entertainer, and the people, the audience. God is the audience, and the people are the performers, and the minister is the prompter. And we get that mixed up, to think the minister is the entertainer and you pay him to entertain you. And when you realize that the people are to be performing before God, I'm not dancing for the congregation. The congregation is dancing for the Lord.
Yeah.
And once you see that, so my job as a minister is not to try to do everything. My job is to encourage and encourage people to do the work of the ministry. So when I was burnt out and realized that, and so started getting people to help preach and help visit and lead worship, a funny thing happened. They wanted to give me a raise every year. And I hadn't had a raise for 10 years. And they didn't really appreciate me. And after they started doing the work, they started appreciating me. So people would rather pay you to watch them work than watch you do the work. But
pay you to work, yes.
So I've been having fun ever since watching the people trying to be the church.
So for the last 50 years then, you've led all these congregations sort of as a cheerleader.
Actually, it's been 42 years.
42 years is since you made that switch.
So, but that was a great discovery. We don't send somebody to college or seminary to be, and the guilt or the temptation of a minister is to be like in Ezekiel, where God gave him a message to tell him turn or burn, basically. Yeah. And they would go listen to him and say, wow, listen to him preach,
Yeah, and he's eloquent.
They took him as entertainment. And so to be an entertainer or to be a priest, to have the religion for other people and say, well, doesn't matter what I do, but this is my holy man, Yeah. Those are things that I learned.
One of the other things that I know is an interesting feature of, so in the 1980s, you and Grandma quit farming and went down to Puerto Rico for a little bit, and then came back here after pastoring down there for a bit. And then, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but since like 84, you said that you felt like really your purpose was to pray.
Yep.
Is your primary function in life. Now, I don't know how long it's been since 1984, but that's a little bit of experience of making a full-time job out of praying. Yeah. Say something about the role of the growth of the church and the work of God, and how you see what you do in prayer as your primary role for our county and church and nation.
And it's an old thing. If you go back to the book of Numbers, the Levites spent from 25 to 30, say 30 years old, to get ready to work. And at 50, they were done. Now, it says they kept the charge, but from 30 to 50, you're supposed to do what you can do. But from 50 on, you're supposed to encourage and train the ones below 30 and encourage the ones between 30 and 50. And there's a temptation when a man gets to be 50, whether he's a farmer or whatever, to go out and buy new land and try to prove he's not getting old. But that age-old thing, going clear back to Numbers, that after 50, your job is to encourage and equip the people coming up to 25 to 30 and performing this. And so I determined then that I was going to not ever compete with anybody between 30 and 50. I would do things, but because they needed to be done, but not to compete with that group. And so I think that your calling changes. And so my job then in praying for this group is being a spiritual covering and an encouragement. Now, if when I'm 50, I start holding on, then the 30 to 50 see me as a threat. They want to wait till I die and get out so they can have their chance. But if I take on a counseling role and encouraging them and setting them up, then they see me as an asset, and they want to hear what I have to say. Mm-hmm. So if you're competing with them, they can't hear you. But if you're encouraging them, setting them up, then they want to hear what you think. Yeah. And so that's an ideal. And I think even though that happened all those hundreds of years ago, it still has something to tell us that the biggest job of a mature Christian is not trying to prove they can still do something, but it's to be calling and equipping and encouraging the 30 to 50 generation.
One of the things, a funny quote you had one time is you tell older people is to say, You have to accept the reality of death, but don't die until you do. And it seems like right now I've been talking to a lot of church leaders who would say that they're kind of the people who are lost in their church right now are the 50 to 65-year-olds who maybe don't have kids at home anymore, maybe have the financial freedom to travel on the weekends and kind of are disillusioned maybe with the church. But really, a lot of churches are full of my age and younger with young families, but that 50 to 60 range is struggling to know how to fit into the church. And it sounds kind of funny when you talk about, scaling back when you turn 50. Well, you're 92, you do what? A weekly Bible study. You preach on fifth Sundays. You've done 1,000 weddings and funerals since that time, however many baptisms. So you're still ministering in an overseeing role among all of these churches and kind of cheering for us young whippersnappers and praying for us, which we appreciate. But you didn't just quit when you got to 50. And I think it's interesting to look too, by you making that decision. I think there was one time you listed like 13 churches that had preachers that got started in our church just because you had a style of leadership that pulled out other leadership and trained them and sent them off to other churches, other places. And so I think that's been a blessing that we'll keep trying to talk you into.
And when you're through, is seeing other people take over, then that takes the pressure off of you to keep performing, Yeah. And I think and as older people come, that's good.
Well, let's for the sake of people who probably finish their commute here, wrap this up for a second. And I'm sure other people maybe have some questions. And if you want to write in and want me to fact check something with Grandpa, you can send us an email at info@toltogether.com, or for those of you on TOL Connect, happy for your thoughts here or further questions. But as we bring this to a close, I think hopefully this gets the wheels turning for people to think about, we're living in a time of cultural confusion. That in no way means the end of the church is anywhere near. We've read to the end of the book, but it might take some creative thinking on how we structure our churches and what we emphasize and what we focus on our clarity on Scripture and who God is. Your line there that you decided you're going to let Scripture judge you rather than you judge Scripture, thinking about the future of the church and the way that it relates to our actual physical relationships with the people around us, and then having clarity on who we are, but then giving people the flexibility to be convicted by the Spirit and grow, and then thinking about the structure of leadership that we have and how we call forth and encourage the next generation. Those are all things that I hope are deeply encouraging for those of you who are listening here, particularly if you're a little worried about the future of your church or your congregation. I hope you heard something in here of a little bit of optimism and what's possible going forward. So we could do another 8 hours of good stories and theological thinking, but thanks for interrupting your breakfast to share some thoughts with us.
Appreciate what you're doing.
Well, for everyone else, you've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.